Are you putting the PowerPoint up? Okay. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Benjamin Penny. I'm a person who works here at the Australian Centre on China and the World, former director of this centre. And it's my honour to be one of the coordinators of the ANU China seminar series. So welcome those in the room and those online. This is a hybrid presentation, thus the camera. It's a great pleasure today to be introducing one of our learned colleagues from another part of the College of Asia and the Pacific, not in this part of campus, but down in that part of campus, from the Crawford School. Jorrit Goossens is a senior lecturer in the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy and a formerly fellow on energy transitions. I've got that right? Yeah, very good. Prior to coming here to the ANU, Jorrit did his PhD in Beijing, so he knows an awful lot about pollution from coal because you live through it every day. At the Research Center for Eco-Environmental Sciences, which is part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Prior to that, he did a Master of Science in the Netherlands at Wageningen University, which is famous for its natural sciences. Apart from being a senior lecturer in the Crawford School, he runs a, do you call it an online resource? Is that right? Yeah. It's not exactly a blog, is it? It's a kind of, it's a proper website. It's a proper website with translations and other texts relating to China's energy policy. It's called the China Energy Portal. I recommend it to all those present in the room and online. It's a resource for documents and information about China and energy in Chinese and somewhat in English. The good bits are in English. And its URL is chinaenergyportal.org. So I recommend that to you. Today, Jorrit will be speaking on China's coal consumption, a very apposite topic, I think, especially with the recent report on climate change, subtitled A Review of Plans for Decarbonisation and an Outlook on Import Demand. So Jorrit, the lectern is yours.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, hi everyone. So as just explained, I'll be talking today about China's coal consumption, where it is, where it's going, and what it'll mean for Australian exports to the country, really. Somewhat in honor of upcoming Earth Day, because of course these all this consumption of coal leads to fairly great emissions of carbon dioxide. So this talk sort of will go over a number of reasons why China's coal consumption has been in the news over the last couple of years, apart from the fairly large emissions resulting from it. First item was the announcement of China's net zero goal. By 2060, China aims to emit no more carbon dioxide emissions, or at least net zero. I'll go into that a little bit more later in more detail. There's also been news about power shortages that occurred over the summer of 2021 and 2022. That's been in the news. We're still hearing recurring messages about China's continued construction of coal-fired power plants. This message that sort of pops up every now and then again. And of course, the embargo on Australian coal. So basically, sort of those four pieces of news, I'll take that, I'll go over that, and I'll try to explain in four different parts. First of all, what is China's coal consumption really? How big is it? What is it used for? A bit of a primer. An outlook, policy review, what's happening in China that will drive coal consumption in the future. Also a policy outlook about how much of that coal that China will be consuming will come from imported coal, and focusing on Australian imports. And lastly, the same question, but answered not with a policy review, but with some modeling work that we did here at the ANU. So first, talking about China's coal consumption and the emissions resulting from it. Roughly, China emits 31% of global emissions, and it is by far the largest emitter as a single country. I think what is especially important here is that we're seeing a bit of a plateau in emissions occurring a couple of years ago, around the year 2013. Since then, a fairly rapid rise again. I'll go over why in a little bit. I think that's total emissions. Of course, China is a big country. That has sometimes been used as an argument, but it's important to realize that even in terms of per capita emissions, and this is a recent update, until recently, Chinese emissions were roughly on par with EU emissions. Since a couple of years, basically since the COVID crisis, those two have diverged, with China emissions being quite a bit larger. Another argument that we sometimes hear is that, yes, China emits a lot of carbon dioxide, but a lot of the goods that it produces, which cause these emissions, are actually shipped abroad, and therefore their emissions should be counted to those countries. That argument used to be true, but is losing a lot of traction in recent years. So here again, total emissions on the left and per capita emissions on the right. And again, we can see that if we look at it in terms of per capita emissions, China and the EU, even when correcting for imported or exported goods, it's really doesn't, there's not a big difference between the two anymore at all. Where do those emissions come from? Here by fuel, coal, oil, and gas, and then cement. So that's not cement production itself, not the energy going into cement production, but from the chemical process of making cement. We can see that coal is by far the largest contributor to those emissions, roughly 70% still, even though the contribution of oil and gas is climbing. What are all those, what is all that coal used for? More than half goes to power generation, roughly 20% to steel making, and another 10% to building materials. So again, that would be cement or concrete, really. And those three, power generation, steel making, and building materials, will be something that I'll talk a lot about in policy, and what policy is doing to reduce or encourage growth in those sectors. But first, again, to sort of give an idea of the scope of those emissions from those three sectors, if we think about coal-fired power generation, how much does China generate power from coal? I could tell you that it's about 53% of global coal-fired power generation, but I think it's a more stat that more impresses if I say that it's a little bit more than the entire rest of the world put together. In terms of steel, it's really quite a bit more than the entire rest of the world put together. And for cement, it's the same story. And again, China is a big country, but these contributions are far greater than its population would justify. China really is an incredibly carbon-intensive economy, with a lot of coal-fired power generation and use of a lot of steel and cement for construction projects that drive its economic growth. There's also a flip side to the story. Fortunately, China does a lot also in terms of renewable energy, construction of wind turbines and solar farms. China leads the world both in what they have installed, roughly a third or more of existing installations by the end of last year. In terms of annual emissions in or installations last year, it was close to 50% for wind and 40% of global installations last year. So very, very big share of renewable energy installations is in China, and that share will only grow over time. So what is the future going to look like? In terms to, or in order to sort of understand where emissions and coal consumptions will be going, I'll talk a little bit about what has happened in the past that has driven this pattern here. Basically, the period 2000 to 2010, which we can see that this fairly rapid growth. That was a period with very large growth of the economy at about 10% a year. It's really quite astonishing. China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001, which really led to that whole story of China is becoming a very big exporter of everything, the factory of the world. And it's also a period where a lot of construction was done for both apartment blocks and transport infrastructure. Then we really do see a trend break. That's going into the 12th five-year plan period, 2011 to 2015. We even see a reduction in total consumption of coal, even though the previous period was more than 10% annual growth, but over this period, they still managed 7% growth annually. So they really decoupled the growth of the economy and the growth of emissions or the consumption of coal. This is a period where China introduced a concept called ecological civilization. So considering the environment a little bit more in how we develop as a country, even introduced into the constitution. And they introduced the concept of key emerging industries, where they really very specifically said our economic growth or our economic activity has been based far too much on emissions intensive industries. We're going to make a switch to sort of new growth industries that are both pay more money and emit less pollutants, such as renewables, so windmills and PV panels, electric vehicles, and sort of the high-tech sectors that would generate a lot of economic activity, not so much emissions. Because of all these things and because of this effective decoupling of economic growth and emissions, that period was really known as the greenest five-year plan in history. Since then, we see another trend break. And so that's the 13th five-year plan and perhaps also the 14th five-year plan period. So starting from 2016 until now, roughly Xi Jinping's tenure. What caused that? Well, one of the things that at least introduced this trend break was a struggle between central and local governments over control of the coal-fired power sector. Basically, in the year 2015, the central government decided to yield permitting power to different provinces, and they all said, good, we'll build a whole lot of them then. Really very panicked reaction from the central government, basically saying, yeah, that was not the idea there. So even though construction of coal-fired power plants shut up, the central government very quickly realized they'd made sort of a mistake, and they retracted control over the permitting process a little bit. They said, you still are in control of permitting, but you can only give permits if and when we judge that your province needs more coal-fired power plants. And there were basically a list of evaluation criteria to determine whether that was the case or not. Quickly after that, we saw a reduction to more normal levels in coal-fired power plants. What's good to note is red line here denotes the capacity factor. So at what sort of percentage of full capacity do these coal-fired power plants run? That used to be about 60%, it's now down to 50%. That's a low use of those coal-fired power plants compared to globally. Globally, this would be closer to 80–85% even. So in China, they're building a whole lot of coal-fired power plants that do not get used a lot. If we look at that permitting peak in 2015, we can see that really was an extreme period. Unfortunately, we've also seen a very new peak over just the last year. This is what you would call COVID stimulus. So these provinces trying to generate economic activity by building more coal-fired power plants. This is odd because in February 2022, the National Energy Agency actually said, in principle, from now on, China does not need any further coal-fired power generation, so we will not allow permits for it anymore. Not a single one. Exceptions, if they are needed for system stability, so basically, with increasing levels of renewable energy, you need to have coal-fired power capacity to balance that out. You might have summer capacity where air can't run very hard in summer, so you need extra capacity then. Those sort of things, yeah, that's okay. And so 106 gigawatts of coal-fired power capacity was actually permitted by provincial governments over last year. That's an enormous amount, and each and every one of those was argued to be necessary for either system stability or supporting renewables. So again, maybe the central government has mistaken how lenient they can be towards provinces running the show in coal-fired power generation or the permitting of it. But yeah, and again, I think that was the important point there. There's really a struggle between what central and local governments want. Central government wants to be more sensible. Local governments are let rip with this build out of coal. That said, even though the central government signals that it doesn't want crazy amounts of coal-fired power plants, they are also somewhat unclear, or definitely less clear than they were in the 12th five-year period, on what sort of sectors they really want economic growth to come from. So in the 12th five-year plan, it was really clear, no more high emissions industries. We really want this to come from renewables, EV, etc., high-tech stuff. Here in 2020, we wrote a piece saying that China was opening or spending a lot of its stimulus money exactly on the wrong sort of sectors. It was, again, more bridges, airports, roads, coal-fired power plants, etc., very emissions-intensive activities. That story repeated itself last year and this year again. So even though the government is, on the one hand, sort of controlling the build-out of coal-fired plants, and even though they have this fairly clear net zero target, they are also helping with encouraging the growth of emissions again through fairly emissions-intensive processes. So if you get these kind of unclear signaling from the central, the local governments are probably not going to take that all too seriously, is my idea on that. So what is it, this net zero target? Does that even mean anything then? And in that sense, it's important to understand it's made up of two pieces. One is net zero emissions by 2060, that's 40 years from now, very far in the future, and emissions to peak before 2030. And if you be cynical, you could say, well, that allows 10 more years of growth of emissions, and only then do we start reducing And it's actually not terribly clear what China's views on this are. Second thing that's important to note is even if we think about peaking by 2030, is that ambitious? Well, probably not so. If we look at sort of what baseline emissions are, so thinking about what we would expect in terms of economic growth, in terms of energy efficiency that sort of naturally improves as an economy or over time, there really is, or pretty much everyone would sort of expect by 2030, emissions in China wouldn't really be greater than they are today. So setting a target of peaking emissions by 2030 is more stating the status quo than really setting an ambitious target. Getting to zero by 2060, that's ambitious, but getting to peaking by 2030 doesn't really need much policy. On the other hand, same net zero plan, or roughly announced together with that net zero plan, is a goal for 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar. That's up or slightly more than a doubling from what it was in 2020. And that's a lot because, again, China is the country that has the most wind and solar panels in the world. Even more astonishing is that provincial governments, the same that are building all those coal-fired power plants, actually have a target that is higher, 1,400 gigawatts, than that national target. And they would achieve that in the next couple of years, not over the next decade. It's an enormous amount of expansion. Not necessarily clear that that is feasible, but we have seen over those past 2 years already a very strong acceleration of those construction of wind turbines and solar panels. How big is that growth? Well, if we translate it to electricity generated, if we first look at demand growth that we would expect for the next 3 years, State Grid has forecasted about 4.5% growth per year. If we would say let's take 3 to 6% as a sort of upper and lower demand levels, you get a growth of between 500 and 1,000 terawatt hours to 2025. If we think of the electricity generations by the additions of what we just saw, and then a high and low level is low is basically continuing growth or continuing the levels of installations that we've seen over the past 3 years, and high levels being the ambition level of provincial level governments, then you can sort of start to see that, well, all that renewable energy capacity might very well completely cover the increases in electricity demand over the next couple of years. And it'll get even better after that. So this latest coal build out probably doesn't make a lot of sense. It's also probably not really going to happen, I think. Again, this is sort of that peak in 2015 would have been much more extreme if the central government hadn't stepped in time. And I think the exact same thing is going to happen with all those permits that have been given over the last year. I think the central government will step in and say, don't do that, this doesn't make any sense. Also, if they do get built, it'll probably just lead to these power plants being run at even lower levels. And it'll probably just mean that there'll be a greater amount of what we call stranded assets. So big projects that get built, but don't really make a lot of money, don't get their investment back. Or in summary, I don't think that necessarily this most recent sort of push for more coal-fired power generation will necessarily lead to more consumption of coal. It'll just be less consumption per plant. Then switching to that second biggest sector, steel making. Again, somewhat unclear signaling from the government. Originally, the government said, okay, we're going to have an economy-wide peaking of emissions by 2030, but there will be a few key sectors that have to peak earlier. Steel was one of them. We'd expect you to peak your emissions by 2025. They've since deferred that again to 2030. There is a steel sector decarbonization plan that's still in the making, so we don't really know just yet what that will contain, but we do know that individual steel makers are already announcing targets that are more ambitious than even the 2025 peaking date, the 2022 or 2023. Again, a sort of unclear signaling from the central government is that steel, which was scheduled to be included in the national carbon market, has since been delayed to an unspecified date in the future. So again, unclear signaling, putting off the ambition, but just as in power generation, I don't think that there will be a lot of increase. In fact, I think that there will be a decrease in emissions from steelmaking. Why? Because there's simply no way that they're going to be consuming more steel over the next couple of years. The construction sector is really falling flat a little bit. You've probably heard news about the what is it? Construction, the residential sector where activity is falling. I don't see that central government sort of stimulus for more construction of infrastructure will really have all that much traction anymore. So I don't see that there will be growth of total steel demand, and that is basically what every projection says. More importantly, there's going to be use of more scrap steel. Basically, as an economy matures, there will be more scrap available. 20 years ago, China started using a lot of scrap. All that stuff, cars and buildings will now be scrapped. That will become recycled material, or that material will be recycled. And steel from scrap is about 90% less emissions intensive than steel from primary production. That's what I've plotted here. So basically, this is stated policy. So what we know China or what China has announced that it will do, and this is a slightly more environmental friendly, 2-degree compatible sort of scenario for both the total growth of steel consumption, which most analysts say has already peaked now, and the share of it that could come from scrap recycling. That will grow, and how quickly that will grow depends a little bit on policy ambition levels. But in any case, over the next few years, so basically this red bar is the steel that is made with coking coal, which is the emissions. You can sort of linearly connect that with emissions. There's no scenario under which emissions from the steel sector will still go up over the next couple of years. Therefore, putting off the peaking date to 2030 is even worse than just stating the status quo. It's probably already peaked now. Other sectors, the cement, so that was the third biggest sector, that will basically be exactly connected to the steel sector, because you use steel and cement sort of in roughly the same proportions. If one goes down, the other goes down, because it's used in construction. EV, China is very quickly decarbonizing its car fleet. Already 26% of sales of vehicles in China is an electric vehicle. That will do, of course, most to reduce the consumption of oil, not coal, but it will reduce emissions. Hydrogen, I will actually skip over that now. It's a smallish target, I will say. But basically, overall, sort of summarizing that bit of the presentation, there has been and there remains a difference in the view between the central and local governments about how good of an investment the coal-fired power plants are. and the same with construction activities. Local governments see it as a good way to encourage short-term economic growth. Central government is trying to rein that in a little bit. And again, even if that is the case, central government is fairly weak on its signaling how it expects these local governments to get their growth, really. Something that we call smokestack stimulus, spending money on those construction projects, on new coal-fired power plants, remains sort of a go-to lever for especially local, but even a little bit central government officials to encourage economic growth in times where it is needed, such as now, times of crisis. Fortunately, the economics of decarbonized growth paths, including how cheap renewables are, how cheap it is to get steel from recycled rather than new materials, how cheap electric vehicles really are to buy and run, that is simply going to change the balance between fossil and renewables over the next years and decades pretty quickly. So that's gives you something of an idea, maybe not necessarily where coal consumption in China is going, but at least sort of the pressures that will steer it. And that's one question: how much coal will China consume? The second question is, where will it get all that coal? Will this affect imports, and will it affect imports from Australia? I think that story starts with this article that Bill Birrells wrote. He basically wrote, China is going to drop its embargo on the imports of Australian coal. For those of you that are not aware, China closed its borders to Australian imports of Australian coal about 2 years ago because they were angry with the government, asking for a inquiry into the origins of the COVID virus. So China punished Australia by saying, we will not import any more of your coal. Since then, the recent news from just these last couple of months is that they are reopening their borders. This journalist from the ABC says, well, that is due to the fact that China sort of shot itself in the foot. It had access to the cheap and high quality Australian coal that cut it off, and that basically hurt itself more than it hurt Australia. Therefore, they are opening up. That's the storyline. I don't agree with that storyline, and I'll explain to you why. First of all, again, sort of framing what are imports of coal to China really, and what are Australian imports. It's a plot here. It's that little bar there. That is Australian imports of thermal coal and of coking coal. Well, basically what it shows is that the vast majority of coal that China consumes, it gets from its own domestic mines, yeah? 7% of thermal coal is imported, and 11% coking coal is imported. And if we look at, zoom out a little bit, so this is just the same plot, but just this little bit, then we can see that, yeah, okay, there's some Australian coal in imports. It makes up about 1.2% of all of the coal consumed in China for thermal coal. Thermal coal is the stuff that you use in power plants, and about 5% of coking coal, which is the stuff that you use for steel making. So are they really, is that really that important that they would hurt so much by cutting that out? You can question that. One thing is, or one thing to understand is, why does China even need to import all that coal? They definitely have the resources. So there is a whole lot of coal in Chinese mines. Most of it, however, and this is really just about 90% of all of China's coal, is mined in these three provinces here: Shanxi, Shanxi, and Inner Mongolia. It's consumed, In coastal areas here, some heavy industry around the Bohai Bay and along the coastal provinces in the south. How does it get there? Well, right now it's mined in these areas, and there are all these rail lines that carry it to ports in the Bohai Bay, and then it gets shipped south. And that is where Australian and Indonesian shipments of coal compete with the shipments from Chinese mines. And basically, the whole exercise of mining that coal, putting it on a train, putting it on a boat, and then shipping it to the south is a very expensive exercise, which means that Australian and Indonesian coal become more competitive versus domestic coal. So over the past 2 years, what has happened? The prices of that seaborne coal, as we would call it, have nearly quadrupled from slightly less than $100 to about $400 for a ton of thermal coal. This had to do with disruptions in coal mining regions due to COVID, also with disruptions in transport systems, again, due to COVID. It's not a very strong argument to think that when China sees prices quadruple, that would be a moment where they would say, oh, we'll actually open the borders to imports again. It's more of an argument for them to say, let's look within our own borders where we can control prices a bit better and use more of that. We've also heard about these power shortages, saying they might be due to China not having access to Australian coal. Summer of 2021, where were they most severe? That was in Guangdong in the south, and these three provinces up north here. In Guangdong, I'll actually switch this out. In Guangdong, it was mostly due, or the red provinces here had so-called a warning for dual control, meaning that the central government said, you're basically close to your quota for emissions, and there will be consequences if you don't meet those quota. And those provinces started to voluntarily throttle the output of or ration the output of electricity to their industry in order to meet climate targets, not because they didn't have access to Australian coal. Provinces in the north here, they would never have imported Australian coal. Australian coal goes to these provinces on the coast in the south, but almost never or never to the north. So it's not a very strong storyline that they really needed it for that. I'll skip over this a little bit. The power shortages in last year. You can see this was a heat wave, one of the strongest heat waves that China ever suffered, even leading the Yangtze River to completely dry up like that. That also gives you an idea of what led to the power shortages. It wasn't a lack of coal, it was a slump in hydropower output upstream from Shanghai, mostly in provinces of Sichuan and Yunnan. It also meant that coal-fired power plants that were along a river could both not receive shipments and could not cool their power plants very well anymore. But again, if we look at where those power shortages occurred, that was mostly in this area here. And again, that's not where Australian coal would flow to. It would flow to the coastal provinces, and then between those coastal provinces and the red area is somewhat of a mountain range. You don't have good rail connectivity. That's not where Australian coal would flow to. That would be supplied by China's own mines. How has China responded to these crises, the crises of the global energy crises and the power shortages at home? Well, basically, they've gotten very nervous. And they have really stressed the issue of what they call energy security. So meaning getting enough fuel and being able to supply enough electricity to their economy. energy security really highlighted in the 3 running government work reports over the last 3 years, and even mentioned 29 times in last year's guiding opinions on energy work. What does that mean? Really sort of switching back to that old stance that coal is really the most secure because we have that at home and because it allows for output that we can control ourselves. So again, in times of crises, they sort of switch back to what they know and say, yeah, we really need coal-fired power generation to sort of stabilize our energy systems to ensure supply. And so we will make sure that the power sector has a lot of coal power supply. I'll skip over that one. One of the things that they did is increase the output of domestic coal mines. Again, so they saw that these prices in global markets were incredibly volatile and very high, and they have those domestic mines, so let's increase output there. How much? They've targeted 4,200 megatons of output by 2025, up from 3,850 in 2020. So over 5 years, they would add about 360 megatons, which is roughly the same amount of coal that Australia exports to the entire world, not just to China. So over 5 years, they would add an entire Australia in terms of coal exports. That was the plan. What has actually happened is that in the last 2 years, they've added 2 Australia's worth of coal output, 650 megatons, and they expect a little bit more in 2023. So what does that mean? Again, does that signal a very big increase in the consumption of coal? Well, not necessarily, because a couple of things have happened with that 650 megatons of coal. One is that they've added that to stockpiles, 300 megatons of it, so about half of the increase has gone into stockpiles. That gives you your energy security. If you've got a lot of coal already dug up out of the ground, you can use that very quickly. It's a sort of strategic reserve. If prices in global markets start to go crazy again, you can use that coal. The other effect that I think it will have is that if they realize that they can dig this much out of the ground, they will start to think again about importing all that much coal in years to come. Those are the sort of short-term responses that they've had. I'll also talk about the long-term response, one of which is improving rail infrastructure. Why do you need rail? Well, that helps you get your coal from your domestic mines to your domestic consumers. The biggest one that they've built is the Haoji rail line, going straight from the coal mining region to the south, exactly to where those power shortages were in the summer of 2022. 200 megatons per year, so roughly comparable to to Australia's thermal coal exports to the world. An enormous amount. The very purpose of this line is to push out exports, the stated purpose. Second thing that they've done long-term strategy, or I should say, even though this is a long-term strategy, they've been planning this for 10 years, but it's operational since last year. A second thing that they've done is opened up more mining capacity in Mongolia, which is which has coking coal, so for steel making, that is comparable in quality to what we have in Australia. Big difference is, and just to give you an idea of the size of that mine, this is 1 square kilometer. This is the new mine that they've built. The difference is that you can see it from space, which gives you an indication that it's very cheap to mine. Output of that thing is about 30 to 50 megatons, which is roughly the same volume that China gets from Australia right now. They've also connected this mine with a number of rail lines that lead directly into China's steelmaking heartland. So really what they've done is they've improve their infrastructure and the mining capacity at home in order to get domestically or Mongolian coal to their consumers, power plants and steel plants, a lot more of it and a lot more cheaply. That's just my reading of the policy or these developments. As a proper academic, we don't just make comments, we also try to model these things. And so we have done that. Precisely what we've done is it's called a linear optimization model. So we ask the model, here's a bunch of coal-fired power plants in China. You have to make sure that they consume this amount of coal. Here's the mines that can produce it. Find the least costly way to supply that demand. And least cost, including the cost of mining and the cost of transport. Transport is important because it is about, or represents about half of the total cost of a ton of coal delivered to a power plant usually. So that's why we focus so much on transport. I've explained that. Secondly, that transport network, previous work would sort of conflate or simplify the Chinese coal system to a bunch of nodes that represent both the production or the consumption for one individual province, and then have links connecting them that represent the transport networks between those individual provinces. We have improved on that a lot by building what we would call an installation level transport network. So we have technical and location detail for every individual power plant and steel plant, every individual railway and stop, every individual port, etc. To give you an idea of what that looks like, so these are the dots. Compare that to the picture just now where you had 30 dots, one for each province. This is where coal is consumed in China. Red is power plants, blue is steel plants. Our transport network looks like this. So it's a great improvement in geographic granularity, really. All that detail really is not for nothing. When we run the model and say, can you predict what Chinese imports of coal, thermal coal and coking coal would be over the years 2015 to 2019, something that we call backcasting, and we use that to sort of see if our model is very good. It does very accurately predict what would have happened. So that gives us confidence that it would predict the future very well as well. And then we ask it in the year 2025, what would happen to who would supply China's coal-fired power plants with the coal that they need. And we have that network, and we color that network by changes in flows of coal. So changes in megatons shipped over individual rail lines between 2025 compared with 2019. And what we see, this dark green line here, that's exactly that new Haoji rail line. We see that precisely leads to an enormous amount of coal flowing from China's key coal mining regions to the south, where those power shortages were. We also see that leads to a reduction in red here in imports of coal from Australia as well as Indonesia in the more southern provinces. Why? Because all that coal here and more coal flowing southwards from the Bohai Bay from China itself. Same exercise for coking coal. There, the big change is really that we see all that coking coal coming from Mongolia. That frees up a lot of coking coal from China to flow south, and again, pushing out imports from Australia and the rest of the world. If we think of that in terms of numbers, yeah, okay, so it's covered. This bar is the same bar as this bar here. That's the 2019 situation. So Chinese imports of thermal coal roughly 50 megatons from Australia, a whole lot from Indonesia, and some from the rest of the world. Our baseline predictions for 2025 in a scenario where China would reduce its consumption a little bit, stated policies or stated ambitions, would already see a fairly substantial reduction in imports. If they get serious about climate goals, then we see a far bigger reduction by 2025 to almost half its current imports. We've also asked, yeah, but what if Australia or Mongolia expand their mining capacity? There would additional capacity available. Would that capacity then be used to increase exports to China again? The answer is pretty much no. It doesn't really change much. We've also asked the model, what if provinces on the coast would decarbonize faster than inland provinces? Or what if it's the other way around? What if inland provinces are asked to decarbonize quicker? Doesn't really make a big difference. And lastly, a bunch of infrastructure scenarios where we look, for example, at that Haoji rail line by itself. What if that rail line did not exist? Would that have made a big difference? Expansion of ports, etc. The big one, however, is what if we would assume that between 2019 and 2025, China would not have changed or not have invested in the expansion of any of its infrastructure. And then you can see that that bar is roughly the same as 2019. So if China would not have invested in infrastructure to get its coal to its consumers, we'd sort of expect for the next 5-6 years that Chinese imports would remain at the level where they were in 2019. However, we know that that infrastructure is there, so we will see a drop. How big is that drop? Depends on how ambitious China will be with its decarbonization plans. Basically, roughly a 25% decrease under its stated policy scenario, roughly a 50% decrease, but in its more ambitious climate targets. And that's over the next couple of years. That's not decades away. That's over the next couple of years. Same exercise for coking coal. Again, we see a fairly substantial drop, especially of Australian exports to China. And it's caused by two things, really. One is the expansion of mining in Mongolia that pushes out about 10 megatons. And of course, you need the infrastructure. If the rail line to Mongolia is not built, then the additional mining in Mongolia doesn't really matter. So basically, summarizing the results of that model a little bit, in 2019, Australia exported about 50 megatons of thermal coal for power generation to China. By 2025, we would see that fall to about 40 to 30 megatons, based or depending on how ambitious Chinese decarbonization really plays out. That was a lot. For coking coal, used to be roughly 30 megatons in 2019. We would see that fall to 20 to 22 megatons, a really fairly narrow range. And that has everything to do with Mongolian supply of the good stuff. Important to understand, so these reductions happen even under moderate decarbonization ambition. If it increases, then they become stronger. And really, the lesson from this is that no matter if China would remain to consume as much coal as it has in the past couple of years, it is very strongly decoupled from the question, how much will it buy from seaborne markets? Because it is so much easier and so much cheaper for China now to supply coal from its own domestic sources. Let me think about what I'm going to say about this. I think I'll probably actually skip this. We've run some results on what happens if we introduce that Chinese embargo on Australian imports of coking coal. Where does China get its coking coal in such a scenario? So baseline, good amount of coking coal coming from Australia. Because of the embargo, our model says we'll get that from North America and a bit more from Russia. We've got a lot of scenarios there. I think I will skip over much of this. The important thing, I think, is the other thing is that our model also says for Australia, what happens when China closes its border. It's not. It used to be a fairly good chunk, almost 25% would go to China. That doesn't mean that China closing its border will lead to market or sales of coking coal by Australia falling by that amount, because it can simply start selling it to other markets. And that's exactly what our model predicts. It goes to Japan, a bit more to India, and a lot more to South Korea. However, there is still a 20 megaton drop between the two scenarios. This is, again, really very precisely what we've seen in actual statistics playing out. Our scenario also says, or our model also says, and this is, I think, again, interesting, for China to close the border, it would sort of increase costs to get the coking coal that it needs, because it needs to find other sources. Those sources will be more expensive by definition. Up until 2019, 2020, closing the border to Australia would have cost China about $5 to $6 billion extra to get all its coking coal. But again, because of the improvements in infrastructure and because of the expanded supply from Mongolia, that cost differential almost disappears entirely. This is also my sort of idea of why China is now happier to open the border again to Australian coal. It's not because it's needed so desperately, because it's secured its own supplies already, and it won't really need Australian coal all that much anymore. So it's a very cheap diplomatic gift. I will skip over that. I've explained that. Summary of the whole thing. Going back to where is China's coal consumption really going? I don't doubt that over the long term, the emissions of carbon dioxide and the consumption of coal in China are going to come down. So again, effectively decoupled completely from economic growth. However, that ambition level for 2030 remains very unclear or very limited. Policymakers in times of crisis still sort of tend to go back to those old levers that the communist governments know. You just build more stuff. That's how you create jobs, economic activity. However, especially in the coal-fired power sector or in the power generation sector, renewables are growing at such a big pace that it might not even matter, no matter how much stimulus goes into coal-fired power, it'll not really change how much power will be generated. One more minute and then we'll get to questions. Second important part is that with the crises, the enormous price increases in global markets and the power shortages in China, energy security has become the goal in China. Alarm bells have been ringing in Beijing, and the way that they fix this is say, we'll get this coal from domestic sources or from reliable suppliers like Mongolia instead. That means, in my view at least, that almost certainly imports of coal, and I should say from the seaborne market, are almost certainly set to come down. I'll also add that unfortunately, when the Chinese policymakers talk about energy security, they talk again about coal, whereas we would usually say actually renewables are a fairly secure source of energy. They're there, you've got it. You're not dependent on any market for fuel. And lastly, we've just seen the IPCC report come out again, and it urges governments, including emerging economies, to bring forward that net zero date. And that's really an important message, because it's very good that China has set that net zero by 2060 goal. That's very ambitious. However, that sort of interim goal that is very unclear and doesn't really specify whether emissions can go up for the next 10 years or whether they will still stable or whether they will already fall a little bit. That'll determine, or what will happen will determine very much how easy it will be to actually attain that goal by 2060. If emissions keep rising over the next 10 years, very difficult. If they get serious already, then it becomes a more feasible goal. And lastly, as that sort of message, one of the ways to actually realize that goal would be to not spend the stimulus money that they spend on coal-fired power and infrastructure projects, spend that instead on renewables, on electric vehicles, or just stimulating consumer or consumption by households. That might not have a very green, but at least it wouldn't have a very gray effect on emissions. That's all I had to say. Happy to take some questions, and yeah, Ben with the mark. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. That was a tour de force. It was quite something. Many of my questions were answered, but I'm sure, like everybody here, I have a million more that I would like to ask you, but it's not my job to ask you questions. The way the questions are going to work, I